Sure, compared to other gacha games, Venezita's story holds up pretty well, but as an experience on its own, right now, at this moment, it's just okay. I think I rated it around a 6 or 7, and honestly, nothing in this 2.1 quest really changes that. Look at that naive young man just blabbering away. If only he had known what was coming with the Wuthering Waves 2.2 story, he'd probably have kept his mouth shut a bit longer. He'd have let Kuro cook because wow, the 2.2 story was something. So in this video, we're diving into the Wuthering Waves 2.2 story quest. We're gonna gush over all the things that we loved because trust me, there's a lot to love. And we're also going to talk about the things that didn't quite hit the mark for me because as great as this story was, there were definitely a few things I wish had gone differently. So stick around, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. What did you think about the story? Was it everything you hoped for, or did it leave you feeling a little nah? Let me know in the comments, and of course don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Alright, let's dive into it. Alright, so here's how we're breaking this video down. We've got two halves. The first half, we're talking about everything we absolutely loved about the story, and the second half, well, we're going to get into things that didn't quite hit the mark for me. But for now, let's start with all the good stuff. Okay, I know a lot of you probably haven't finished the story yet, or maybe you haven't even played it at all, and that's totally fine. So to keep things spoiler free, I'm going to keep things super vague for now. But I cannot guarantee that there will not be some minor spoilers along the way, so if you don't want to hear anything about the story and would rather experience it firsthand, feel free to leave the video, play the story, then come back when you're ready. I'll make sure to keep things as spoiler free as possible so you don't have to worry about anything we haven't seen in the trailers. Alright, with that said, let's dive in. Okay, so here's the lowdown on the 2.2 story. It picks up right after the 2.0 story. We've just met Cathartia, and we're trying to figure out a way to meet her again and even get a chance to meet Imperator. Turns out there's a way to reach the Seronosphere in the sky where both of them are hanging out, but to get there, we need to get involved with the Phasalia family, especially the head of the family, Cantarella. We meet Cantarella, and after some lore drops about the Phasalia family and their connection to Imperator, we learn that Cantarella holds the key to getting us to the sky. So after some traveling, we finally reach the Seronosphere, the brand new location, and that's where we meet the real Cathartia. So it would seem that the version of her we've seen up until now was just a part of her consciousness, but now we're seeing the full thing. The whole story takes place in a new location, and it's all about undoing certain seals. Along the way, we dive into the lore of Cathartia, Imperator, and all the events that led to Renacita being in its current state. By the end of the journey, we find out that the Cathartia we've known isn't the full version. She's just part of Fleur-de-Lis, another entity sealed within the location. After a climactic battle, we defeat Fleur-de-Lis and everything falls into place. The story wraps up with a final meeting with Imperator, where everything gets resolved. The problem with Abby, Carthia, and everything else. It's a happy ending, even if the end was a little bit cliche. Alright, now that we have all that covered, let's talk about things we absolutely loved about the story. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the female characters introduced in this story. One thing that was carried over from Hong Zheng is the lack of male characters in the entire Renacita story. For the most part, we haven't really had any male characters who stood out much except Brant, but we get introduced to a lot of female characters, and for a second, I thought we might still be dealing with the whole gathering wives trope that we saw in previous stories. And to my relief, even though it does slightly exist, it's done significantly better. Meeting Cantarella and Carthia, I honestly expected to feel that weird obsessive dynamic we had with characters like Chun-Li, Shorekeeper, and Camellia, but I'm happy to report that it's completely gone. Cantarella doesn't care at all about who we are in any romantic sense. She's aware of our status, sure, but there's no obsession like there was before. It's the same with Carthia. There's a bit of tension and it's slightly romantic, but I love how they handled it this time. In the past, when they tried to do romance, especially with the Rover, it felt super in your face and uncomfortable, almost like they were forcing it. But with Carthia, they kept it subtle. There are these little cute moments, like when she holds onto you as you fall off a waterfall, or when she rests her head on your shoulders. It's sweet and endearing without being uncomfortable or awkward. Even by the end, when they get closer and she says, "I want to be your equal," she wants to protect you and keep you safe. But there is something I really respect about this direction. They show mutual respect and understanding between the characters, rather than some one-sided obsession. What I really love is that Carthia and Cantarella sees us as equals. Yes, we're stronger, but they recognize our strengths and respect it without feeling the need to act like we're above them. This new approach with regards to interacting to the female characters, especially with Cardathea, is something that's not just acceptable but really well done. The Gathering Rise vibe isn't completely gone, but they've made it so much more comfortable to watch, and honestly, I wouldn't mind if they kept this direction moving forward. Another thing I really appreciate about the Renacita story, not just this particular chapter, but the entire arc, is how the Rover takes a backseat in the narrative. Now, if you remember the Jingzhou quest, the Rover was constantly being put on a pedestal. Everywhere they went, everyone was bowing to them, calling them some big deal, and it honestly felt a bit forced. That kind of hero worship was a bit much. In Renacita though, there is a refreshing shift. Yes, the Rover still has importance, but the story shifts focus to the world itself. The lore of Renacita really takes center stage. We get so much more about the environments and characters. Take the Montellis for example. Instead of just hearing about the Rover, we get deep dives into the history, the traditions, the internal workings of the Montellis. It's more about the world than the Rover, and I love that. And as the story progresses, we dive into Imperator's connection with all sorts of beings, whether it's the Phasalia families, Cardathea, the Thernodian, or any other faction. The Rover is more of a passenger along for the ride, solving problems and keeping things in order, but they are not the center of the universe here. In the version 2.2 story quest, the MVP has to be Cardathea. We learn so much about her sacrifice, her past, and everything she's been through. She's such a richly developed character, and it's such a nice change of pace from how the Rover was treated as the focal point of everything. Here, we see the richness of Renacita's world with its deep history and lore, and it feels so much more balanced. I love that while the Rover's role was still crucial, the narrative doesn't just revolve around them. The focus on the world, the characters, the backstories made this story so much more immersive. It feels like the world is alive and that there is more to it than just the Rover's journey, which makes everything feel that much richer and more fulfilling. Alright, now let's talk about the writing for a second. Now this discussion is going to be a bit shorter than the other points of discussion, but I think it's worth mentioning. After I made the video complaining about Genshin's writing and how they treat the players like they're 3-year-olds, I was really curious to see if Wuthering Waves had the same issue. You know, repeating dialogues, making everything painfully obvious, having the Rover do something and then a character asking if they did it, stuff like that. And to be honest, yeah, those things do pop up in Wuthering Waves, but not nearly as often as Genshin Impact. There were a couple of moments where the Rover asked a question that I just couldn't understand. Like, why would you ask if she was singing when you just heard her sing? But honestly, these instances are few and far between, maybe 2 times at most throughout the whole story. Most of the time, the game trusted us to remember things that were already told. And when it brought things up again, it did not over-explain. It was more about briefly simplifying something that might not have been already clear, which I can appreciate. The real win here is that Wuthering Waves treats its player base like actual human beings. Whether or not they think the players are kids, they don't dumb down the story or make us feel like we're being spoon-fed information. It's just refreshing to experience a game that treats the story like a real story and not some overly simplified kid-friendly nonsense. It's nice to feel respected as a player and like you're using your brain while playing. Alright, now let's talk about the environments. Now, this may be recency bias, but let me just say this up front. This might be one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen in gaming. And I don't mean just gacha games, I mean in gaming period. I've tried to think of other places that could be better, but honestly, I can't come up with one. I've lost count of how many times I've just stopped in the middle of my journey to take in everything around me. There were even times when I intentionally took detours, choosing the longest route just to experience the world more. You get these incredible cathedrals, these gorgeous buildings, and I'm telling you, it's not just about the visuals, there's so much lore in this environment. Entering these spaces, you don't just see the lore, you hear the lore in the music, you feel the lore in the environment. You can look around and instantly imagine how this place would have looked like in its prime. You can see where people would have gathered, prayed, trained. The design is so detailed and immersive that you can't help but connect with the history of it all. I really can't praise the design enough. It's stunning, and not only does it look beautiful, it feels beautiful. And then you've got the enemies, the knights and dragons, fitting so perfectly into this religious and somewhat medieval aesthetic of the environment. When you see them, it just clicks. They belong here. Everything in this environment contributes to the story and the world building in such a meaningful way. The environment didn't just add to the game, it elevated the entire experience, fitting the narrative and aesthetics almost perfectly. Honestly, I loved every single bit of it. And a quick side note, but I really love how the story showed off the Rover's physical strength. Look, I don't know about you, but with characters like the Rover in Wuthering Waves or the Traveler in Genshin Impact, you don't really get the feeling that they're physically strong. You look at them and think it's all about their abilities, but the Rover in this story, they really showed us that yeah, they're strong without needing any buffs or magic, and that was a nice touch. There were these little moments throughout the story, especially in the environment, where you had to literally change the surroundings. Now, in a lot of games, you usually just press a button or flip a switch or something. But here, the Rover just punches the environment and things just change. That's some serious strength, and it's not something that just anyone could do. I loved how the game showcased that. It was refreshing to see the main character physically capable, not just relying on magic or powers, but actually being strong in their own right. That's something I really appreciated. Alright, now let's dive into the gameplay, and just a heads up, we might get into some serious spoiler territory, so if you're not about that, make sure to skip to this timestamp. Okay, so the MVP of the gameplay, without a doubt, was the fights with Fleur-de-Lis. Honestly, it was even better than I expected. It was cinematic, it was intense, and just a solid story-driven fight. But what I loved the most about it, and I'm sure you all loved it too, was the fact that you could use all your elements. The idea for the Rover to be able to use multiple elements, especially in the way he does, is something that was gotten straight from Genshin Impact, and to be honest, I'm all for it. Something I don't quite appreciate though is how neither the Traveler nor the Rover can use multiple elements simultaneously in game when we have seen both of them do as much in cutscenes. We've always had to go into the menu and switch the elements manually, so for the first time we got to use all the elements at once during the fight with Fleur-de-Lis, and that was such a game changer. It made me wish that in future updates or releases, maybe we could switch between elements on the fly. And speaking of elements, let's talk about the wind element. Now, it's not as convenient as strong as the others, at least for me, but it's definitely grown on me. Using it added a lot more depth to the Rover's playstyle, and it made me want to use the Rover even more. Overall, I love the direction they've taken with the gameplay. The fact that they made us use all three elements in that fight was amazing, and I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for future updates. And the wind element is a nice addition that makes the Rover feel more complete and adds that extra fun factor to the gameplay. Alright, so we've covered a lot of the things I really loved. Now let's talk about the things that didn't quite sit right with me. Now, I'm not saying that these things ruined the game, they definitely didn't, but they were enough to make me tilt my head just a bit. First off, Cantarella. You see, this is an issue because of how the Phasalias have been portrayed since we entered Renacita. It's one thing if we were just told that they were bad, but we've seen their actions firsthand. The story kicks off with us chasing the Phasalia, and we have seen that more than any other family in Renacita, the Phasalias are the ones working closest with the Order, who are a very morally grey bunch. This paints a clear picture of who the Phasalias are, so when they introduce Cantarella as a straight up hero, it doesn't sit well with me. Given everything the Phasalias have done, I would have expected her to be more of an anti-villain rather than a full-on hero. Instead, they made her like Chong-Li, sly and low-key but not really bad or evil. It felt like a cop-out. If you're going to advertise a family as problematic and make somebody the head of this family, you should expect that this person should also be a little problematic themselves. There's nothing wrong with making a character morally grey or creating an anti-hero rather than trying to make them all good when they clearly have a darker history. Lastly, and honestly, this is the most disappointing part of the story for me, is that we still haven't been introduced to a single Thernodian. This is especially frustrating because there are references to a battle with Overthrax in this story. Now, there are two possible things going on here. One is the writers might be acknowledging that we've already fought a Thernodian, but that's not true. We fought the Dreamless, not Overthrax. Or maybe the writers are suggesting that the Rover has experienced something on a Thernodian level before. Either way, I was really hoping that with all the reference to Sentinels and Thernodians, we'd finally get to see the world from a Thernodian's perspective. We've heard so much about them being enemies of nature and just as powerful as the Sentinels. Every time the Sentinel's name came up, the Thernodian's name was right there alongside with it, but we still haven't had a proper interaction with the Thernodian. I do appreciate that the story provides a solid reason for why we couldn't see the Thernodian in Renacita, but I can't help but feel disappointed. I was hoping for at least a conversation with the Thernodian to understand their perspective, but it just didn't happen. With all the build-up, I expected more. I'm still holding out hope that when the time comes for us to face one, it'll be worth the wait. And given how well the writing has been so far, I have no doubts that it will be, but for now, it was a big letdown. So when it comes to my overall thoughts on this story, if I was to give it a score out of 10, honestly, I would give it a solid 9 or at least an 8.5 out of 10. It was an extremely satisfying story. It really makes you appreciate everything you went through throughout the entire Venezita's quest. And I think it wrapped things up quite nicely. Sure, there are still some loose ends to address like the Fraxidus and Cristoforo and all that, but for what we have so far, especially regarding the Sentinel, the Thernodian, and Venezita, I think they did a fantastic job. It was a great story with a satisfactory ending, and I'm happy with what we got. But hey, I'd love to know what you think. Do you agree with my analysis, or do you think I missed something? Was there anything about the story that didn't quite sit right with you? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.